welcome to the Middle Ground Podcast, a platform where young people in South Africa can objectively engage in complex and pressing matters.
I'm Kanto, this is Justin Downey, and you're watching and listening to another episode of the Middle Ground Podcast, where we objectively engage on pressing and complex matters which we believe that South Africans from all walks of life should be engaging on. Well, today we're going to be discussing the topic of are enough young people voting, or should more young people be engaging in those sort of politics and actually casting their vote so they can actually have a say in the country. And it was interesting, I was having a look at a few stats the other day from the IEC, the fact that young people under the age of 20 are at their lowest in terms of registering to vote since 1999. And also the fact that, the biggest segment of voters, which is between the ages of 18 and 29, were at its lowest since over the past decade. And to be honest, you can't really blame them, because when you look at the statistics as to what might contribute to that, is that, people between the ages of 16 and 24, the unemployment rate is about over 50% and close to 60%. And that statistic has been compared to countries such as Bosnia, Herzegovina, and also Eswatini, which is previously known as Swaziland, which is amongst one of the worst in terms of youth unemployment. And this is according to, the World Bank statistics. So when you look at those kinds of things, you can kind of understand why certain people might feel, what's the point? I'm not really that well represented. I'm not being heard. So why should I go cast my vote if I just feel like nobody's really listening to my issues, what I'm facing, and the problems and the challenges that I face on a daily basis?
Yeah, so I think we have two types of, discrepancies when it comes to young people voting. Mm-hmm. I feel like we've got young people that have just kind of lost that sense of hope for the country, with like a lot of bad news going around, with a lot of unemployment, with low future prospects for the youth of the country. Like you said, we have 58% youth unemployment, I think. And that youth number is quite large. It's quite a big gap. It's not actually like 16 to 20. It's like 16 to 34 or something like that, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a large proportion of the country unemployed. And it directly is correlating to the fact that people aren't voting. People aren't feeling that their vote maybe matters, or they're maybe not feeling that they have the power to make a difference. Yeah. Now, I understand that with voting, one person, one vote, right? So you might feel like your vote is small, but to make up the majority, everybody has to obviously, go and cast a vote. So I think the two differences is, one is maybe people coming from a sense of privilege, thinking that voting might not, influence them, or whatever's happening in the country might not influence them directly. And as such, there might be just a lack of care. Yeah. And then there's the more, the desperate side, where people are kind of just like they've given up hope, they've lost that kind of feeling for the ability to make a change. And that's another major issue. And that, I think, more closely ties to the unemployment statistics. A lot of people do feel misrepresented or not represented at all by political parties, myself included. I feel like there isn't a political party at the moment that is accurately portraying what I want them to, that's not representing my thoughts on government, that's not thinking forward enough, that's just not progressive enough for what I kind of want going forward. And I think a lot of people are starting to feel that kind of way. They're tending away from the two giants, the ANC and the DA. We've seen recently the EFF gain a lot of momentum. We've seen FF Plus gain some momentum. And we've seen a lot of parties around that forming, starting up, trying to make a big push, trying to gain certain metros. And I think the reason for that is that people are just growing dissatisfied with the traditional parties that everyone was voting for. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I think the state of the country is directly indicative of the unwillingness to vote in that kind of regard. And I think everyone needs to be very much educated on the reason we vote. And the reason we are voting at the end of the day is accountability. Yeah. Your vote means that you are holding someone accountable. People, they campaign for your votes, which are meant to keep them accountable. When a political party doesn't deliver, then another political party should win the next election, like we see in the States with, Democrats and Republicans. It keeps hopping around. That should be the case, but it hasn't. The majority of the people have voted ANC extremely loyally. And that's why I think they've maintained power for the last 27 years. And the fact of the matter there is that loyalty to political parties is never a good thing. Why do I say this? Is because the minute you're overly loyal to a political party and you're not critical or not cynical of political parties, is that they tend to run away with things. They tend to do whatever. They tend to not feel like there's any pressure on them from the outside. You see, what keeps political parties in check is outside pressure. Is that if you don't perform, that you're not going to make it to the next election, that you're not going to be a serious party. And the system of South Africa is such that it's easy enough to establish a political party. So it should be easy enough to say, oh, well, you guys didn't do well this 4 years or this 8-year period, if maybe they won in both elections, then it should be easy enough to switch to a new one. But that's not happening in South Africa. People are loyal to one or the other. And it's a massive issue because we see for extended periods of time, certain people in certain places of power, and it tends to have a general negative effect on the economy and the economic climate that we exist in. So, yeah, I think that's one of the major issues that we're seeing at the moment with why people aren't casting their votes.
And I think another thing on that point, Justin, in terms of, people don't feel represented enough, and also you touched on economic policy. As young people, we need to understand that political policy influences economic policy, because there's a ruling party which comes up with policy, and when they get into government, what happens is that policy begins to influence how, trade takes place within a country. And if that policy is not necessarily conducive to how trade is facilitated within the country, what that then does is that it influences, the economic activity, the economic growth, and also, to a certain extent, influx of external or foreign investment. And what happens is that, when things like that aren't taking place within an economy, is that, there's no necessarily any activity. That means there's no value being added. There's not enough opportunities being created, which can then lead to things such as unemployment going down, etc., etc. So that's why I think it's a very important thing to touch on, that we need to understand that, by not voting, we're not necessarily solving the problem. But what we're doing is that we're just keeping the problem there. We might not be getting rid of it, but we're just keeping it there. And what I'm trying to say is that I think it should be a thing where we shouldn't necessarily be loyal to a party. And I mean, there's a lot of alternatives coming up now, and certain people actually, going for those alternatives, if I can put it that way. And the reality is, once we can actually objectively look at, politics as a means of ensuring that certain things within the country are facilitated in a certain way, much rather than, I'm loyal to this party, I'm loyal to that party, but we can objectively look at, okay, what have they done? What can they do for us going forward? And how can they include every single person in terms of growing this country and taking this country forward? I believe that's when we'll actually see, if I can say, a productive change, an advancing change. And that's where we can actually get to a place where we can actually move this country forward.
Yeah, I think we mentioned earlier that youth politics, youth parties, with their state of disarray. When last time we heard about the ANC Youth League, for example, the last time they were featuring was when Malema was still the head of the ANC Youth League. And I feel like, that was before 2013. So there's been a long state of youth politics kind of going unheard. There's been a long spout of the youth not being represented as the youth as they stand today. Most of our politicians are significantly older, and I feel like there might be a bit of a disconnect in a current environment and a progressive environment. I feel like the world is ever tending towards more progressive ways, and I feel like with a more elderly government, you might not always get that kind of, direction. You see, at the end of the day, like you said, they shape economic policy, tax systems, import, export, all these kind of foreign investment, but they also shape the social aspects of a country. You see, we've recently seen that racism, sexism, all these kinds of things get more harshly punished in everyday society. But that's on government to push it in that direction. It's on government to enforce these kinds of things. It's in government to ensure that we are a more progressive society, that we are at the forefront of things, not just chasing tails all our life. And I feel like with the youth not being actively involved in policy-making decisions, we might get left behind on a worldly scale. We see that there are too many career politicians that have been there as long as I've been alive, that have basically taken up space in a sense of they haven't maybe meaningfully contributed as much as what you would think someone would contribute in 30, 40 years. South Africa, I know we're a young democracy, so career politicians, 20, 30 years. But in the States, we have guys like Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton that have been in politics all their life. Now, for me personally, I struggle to trust career politicians. I think everyone's got that little bit of mistrust in politicians at the moment. And there's a reason for this. When in economic downturn, we tend to find that politicians are the ones making those policies that are allowing businesses have to operate within that. Within that framework that is set out by the government. Now, when we have accounting scandals, everyone looks to the accounting board and they go, why are the accountants doing this? The same way we should be looking at the country, we should be looking at the government of our country. So that accountability measure is an issue in South Africa, specifically at the moment, holding people accountable. Your vote is meant to be that mechanism, whereas at the moment, it hasn't really been. I think that identity politics is also another thing ruining the state of politics in the country. We see someone from a certain background or a certain thought process say something, and instead of listening to what he said and reacting on that, we're reacting on who said it. I think that inherently itself is leading to a gap that is not being filled. Certain people aren't saying certain things because I'm going to be attacked for who I am. I'm not listening. We're not taking these matters into consideration and actually forwarding ourselves based on that. And that's another massive issue that I think we can chat about is identity politics on its own. Is it helpful? Does it really contribute? The cancel culture of cancelling certain people for saying certain things, when regardless of what might have happened before, what might have happened after, those kinds of trends, I feel are also maybe a ruining factor in politics today.
Well, there you heard it. So please do give us your comments, your thoughts, potential solutions which you might think. What can get us as young people to pretty much be more involved in terms of voting politics? Now, again, you don't need to be a politician to cast your vote. You don't need to be a politician to have your say in terms of how certain policies function within a country. Thank you for watching. We'd love to hear from you. So please do give us your thoughts, give us your feedback, and we can hear from you, we can engage. Thank you for watching, and we really hope you have a great one.
Remember, politicians are meant to serve you. It's not the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Feel free to share your thoughts and contribute possible solutions to this week's topic.